Hi, I'm Lynn Wise, and with me today is Eugene Chausovsky, and today we're going to be talking about the renewed competition between Russia and the West and the future of Ukraine. So, Eugene, in the Cold War, Germany really found itself divided between the Soviet Union and the West. And Ukraine has kind of taken that role in this renewed competition. Can you tell me a little bit about the similarities between these two different times?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, Ukraine has, as you mentioned, taken on a similar, though not exactly the same role that Germany had during the Cold War. And this really started a couple of years ago when the Euromaidan uprising broke out in Kiev. That then led to Russia taking over Crimea and the conflict that continues to this day in eastern Ukraine. So you essentially have Ukraine split between parts of the country which are now either de facto or even officially part of Russia, although Ukraine would of course dispute that, and then the rest of the country which has become a lot closer to the West. Now, Ukraine is not Western Germany. It's not officially in the EU. It's not in NATO, although it would like to be potentially at some point in the future. But it's very much backed by the West. It's trying to get closer to the EU, to NATO. There's a lot of political, economic, security assistance happening from the West to Ukraine. So essentially, that's where Ukraine finds itself right now, split between these two rival blocs.
But we see Russia and the West kind of about to participate in these Minsk talks. And Ukraine is split, but there's also divisions within each part. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that's complicating peace talks?
Right. So there's actually a number of different peace talks happening at one time. Mm-hmm. So you have the Minsk talks, which are essentially between Ukrainian, Russian, and separatist representatives and the OSCE over the tactical aspects of the conflict. Then from a higher level, you have the Normandy talks, which include Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia. And essentially, each part of these talks has their own agenda, has their own goals that they're trying to accomplish. Of course, Ukraine, it wants to reintegrate Crimea, it wants to reintegrate eastern Ukraine. That's something that's very difficult because Russia has its demands, essentially. Crimea is pretty much off the table from Moscow's perspective. Eastern Ukraine is more negotiable, although they're trying to get a lot more autonomy on things like foreign policy, defense policy. And then with all of that, you have even different interests between countries like the US, which is kind of pushing a more hawkish stance. And then you have countries like Germany, France, which want to negotiate more, which want to be sort of more open to how the conflict can settle. They want to basically get the sanctions that they've implemented on Russia eased, although not before Russia implements its own aspects on the security side of things. So there's a lot going on, a lot of different interests at stake, and that's really complicating the entire process.
So what does Russia want for eastern Ukraine? Do they want to formally annex it, or?
Right. So, for Russia, eastern Ukraine is an avenue to accomplish its broader goal for Ukraine, which is the country's neutralization, meaning that the country is not aligned to the West. It's not trying to seek to become part of the EU, especially part of NATO. That's something that Russia had actually accomplished several years ago and something that it lost when the Euromaidan uprising happened. So then Ukraine sort of flipped and became very much integrated with the West and very much oriented towards the West. Russia is trying to prevent that from happening. And eastern Ukraine is one avenue that Russia has to try to do that. So whereas it hasn't been able to force Ukraine to get back into the Russian fold, essentially what it's trying to do right now in eastern Ukraine is undermine the government in Kiev, bleed the Ukrainian state, militarily, economically, in the hopes that eventually that Ukraine will become, at the very least, neutral. I think a pro-Russian Ukraine at this point is very unlikely, at least for the foreseeable future. So eastern Ukraine is an avenue for Russia to accomplish that broader goal.
But Ukraine is not the only battleground, essentially, between Russia and the West. And is there a risk of this competition spreading, or of more Ukraines being created in other parts of Central Asia, for example, or in the former Soviet periphery?
Absolutely. And in fact, it already has. The conflict that we're seeing in Ukraine is obviously the most intense, but this Russia-West rivalry is happening throughout the former Soviet periphery. It's happening in countries like Belarus, countries like Moldova, in the Caucasus, Georgia. These are all countries that are oriented one way towards the other, For example, Belarus is close militarily with Russia, but lately we've seen them open up economically towards the West. It's not going to go as far as Ukraine is because it has its own strategic interests in mind, but that is a zone of competition. Moldova is a similar situation where you have pro-Russian parties competing with pro-European parties in the country to the point of deadlock, essentially. So you have these countries that have sentiment on both sides and that are being contested over whether it's politically, whether it's economically, militarily. That's happening throughout the former Soviet periphery. And really that's been happening since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's just that it's been intensified over time. And the Ukraine crisis has really kind of shed light on where this is happening throughout the region.
Well, then after the Cold War, we had all of these frozen conflicts that we talk about a lot. And is that where Ukraine is going, or where is the conflict headed?
It seems like right now that there is no real end to the conflict in sight, at least in the near term. I mean, there are negotiations happening as we've discussed, but because the sides are so far apart and because really you have rival geopolitical imperatives in play, with Russia trying to make sure that Ukraine is pro-Russian or at the very least neutral, the West and especially the US is trying to make sure that Ukraine is not part of Russia's sphere of influence. But in terms of a major settlement, this is something that's been, the underlying drivers have been there for such a long time that it's hard to see this ending completely in that sense. Then yes, you can call it a frozen conflict.
Thank you. It really seems like a volatile situation, and we'll be following it closely. For more on the competition between Russia and the West and Ukraine, please visit Stratfor.com.